The winter of 1847 struck the Dakota Territory with unusual cruelty. Snow began falling in early October and refused to stop, blanketing the vast prairie in white silence that stretched beyond the horizon. Sarah McKinnon pressed her face against the frosted window of her small cabin, watching the endless white expanse where her husband's grave lay buried somewhere beneath 3 feet of snow. 3 months had passed since tuberculosis claimed James McKinnon, leaving Sarah alone on their homestead with nothing but debt, a failing crop, and the bitter knowledge that the neighboring settlement viewed her as a burden they could no longer afford to carry. At 26 years old, with auburn hair and green eyes that had once sparkled with hope, Sarah now appeared gaunt and hollow, her cheeks sunken from rationing the little food she had left. The knock on her door came just after dawn on November 15th. Sarah opened it to find 3 men from the settlement council standing on her porch, their breath creating white clouds in the frigid air. Elder Thomas Hartwell, a stern man with a grey beard and piercing blue eyes, served as their spokesman. "Mrs. McKinnon," Hartwell began, his voice carrying the weight of finality, "we've come to discuss your situation." Sarah invited them inside, though her small cabin offered little warmth. The fire in her hearth had dwindled to barely glowing embers, and she had been saving her last pieces of firewood for the coldest part of the night. The men removed their hats but kept their heavy coats wrapped tightly around them. "We understand your grief," continued Hartwell, though his tone suggested little sympathy. "But winter shows no mercy to sentiment. The seed money he borrowed last spring, the tools he purchased on credit, the medical expenses from his illness, it all amounts to more than this homestead could ever be worth." Sarah's hands trembled as she folded them in her lap. She had known this conversation would come eventually, but hearing the words spoken aloud felt like receiving a physical blow. "Furthermore," added Marcus Webb, a younger man who owned the general store, "you have no means to work this land come spring. A woman alone cannot manage a homestead of this size, and we cannot continue providing charity indefinitely." The third man, elderly David Morrison, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He had been friends with James and clearly found this conversation distasteful, but economic necessity left no room for sentiment. "What are you suggesting?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. "We're offering to take over the debt in exchange for the property," Hartwell explained. "This would leave you free to return to your family in Pennsylvania, assuming they would take you in." Sarah's heart sank. She had no family in Pennsylvania or anywhere else. Her parents had died when she was 18, and she had no siblings. James had been her entire world, and when he died, she truly became alone in ways these men could not understand. "I have no family to return to," she said quietly. The 3 men exchanged glances. This information clearly complicated their plans. "Well," Hartwell said after a long pause, "there are other options. The territorial government has provisions for situations like yours. They could arrange transport to one of the eastern cities where you might find employment as a domestic servant or factory worker." Sarah knew what that meant. Single women with no money, no connections, and no protection often found themselves in desperate circumstances in those eastern cities. The lucky ones found legitimate work that paid barely enough to survive. The unlucky ones faced choices no woman should have to make. "I need time to consider," she said. "Time is a luxury none of us can afford," Webb replied sharply. "Winter deepens every day, and maintaining this property costs resources we don't have. You have until the end of the week to decide." After the men left, Sarah sat alone in her cold cabin, staring at the dying embers of her fire. She understood their position, even if she resented their coldness. Resources were scarce, and every family had to focus on their own survival. But understanding their logic did nothing to solve her impossible situation. That evening, as snow began falling again, Sarah wrapped herself in every blanket she owned and ventured outside to gather more firewood from the small pile behind her cabin. The temperature had dropped so low that the snow crunched loudly under her feet, and the wind cut through her clothing like knives. As she bent to collect an armload of wood, she heard something that made her freeze in terror, the sound of approaching horses. In this remote area, during such harsh weather, unexpected visitors usually meant trouble. Sarah quickly gathered her wood and hurried back toward her cabin. But before she could reach the door, 3 riders emerged from the blowing snow. They were Native Americans, and Sarah's blood turned to ice. Stories of raids and attacks filled the conversations of every settlement, though she had never seen evidence of such violence herself. These 3 men sat motionless on their horses, watching her with expressions she could not read in the dim light. The leader, A tall man with long black hair and wearing a heavy buffalo coat spoke in English. Woman, alone? Sarah nodded, too frightened to speak. Husband. Dead, she managed to whisper. The three men spoke among themselves in their own language for several minutes, while Sarah stood frozen in the snow, clutching her firewood like a shield. Finally, the leader turned back to her. You have food? Sarah shook her head. She had perhaps 3 days' worth of flour and a small amount of dried meat, but she was not about to invite these strangers to share her meager supplies. The leader studied her for a long moment, then said something to his companions. One of them, a younger man, dismounted and approached Sarah's woodpile. He began loading wood into his arms. Please, Sarah said, finding her voice. I need that wood. The leader held up his hand. We help, he said. You need more wood for cold time. Sarah watched in confusion as the three men worked efficiently to stack more wood beside her cabin than she had managed to gather in the past week. They moved with purpose and skill, clearly accustomed to harsh winter conditions. When they finished, the leader approached her directly. My name, Running Bear, he said. You are McKinnon woman? Sarah was surprised he knew her name. Yes. Your husband good man. He trade fair? Speak truth. Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes. These were the first kind words about James she had heard since his death. The men from the settlement had only spoken of his debts and failures. White settlement help you? Running Bear asked. Sarah looked toward the distant lights of the settlement, barely visible through the blowing snow. They want me to leave. Running Bear nodded as if this answer did not surprise him. White men think only of profit. Land is tool for money, not home for living. The young man who had been stacking wood said something in their language, and Running Bear responded with what sounded like agreement. My nephew says you look like the woman who starves. Is true? Sarah felt ashamed to admit her desperate circumstances, but something in Running Bear's manner suggested genuine concern rather than mockery. I have very little food left, she admitted. Running Bear turned to his other companion and spoke briefly. The man reached into a large pack tied to his horse and withdrew what appeared to be dried meat wrapped in animal hide. He handed it to Sarah. Pemmican, Running Bear explained, will keep you strong through cold time. Sarah accepted the package with trembling hands. The dried meat mixture would provide more nutrition than anything she had eaten in weeks. Why are you helping me? She asked. Running Bear was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider his answer carefully. Your husband helped my people when others would not. Last spring, when sickness come to our camp, he bring medicine. Cost him much money, but he asked nothing in return. Sarah had not known about this act of kindness. James had never mentioned it, though it explained some of the debt the settlement council had referenced. White settlement not remember such things, Running Bear continued, but Lakota remember. Debt of honor must be paid. Sarah felt overwhelmed by this unexpected kindness from strangers who owed her nothing, while her own neighbors sought to cast her out. Thank you, she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. Winter grow worse before it grow better, Running Bear warned. Settlement white men will not change their hearts. You must decide what path you will walk. With that cryptic statement, the three men mounted their horses and disappeared back into the blowing snow as suddenly as they had appeared. Sarah stood alone in front of her cabin, holding the precious package of pemmican and staring at the pile of firewood that would keep her alive for many more days. For the first time since James's death, she felt something other than despair. She did not know what Running Bear had meant about deciding her path, but his kindness had given her strength to face whatever choices lay ahead. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Sarah was awakened by frantic pounding on her door. She opened it to find young Billy Morrison, David Morrison's grandson, breathless from running through the snow. Mrs. McKinnon, he gasped, you need to come quick. There's been an accident. Sarah quickly wrapped herself in her heaviest coat and followed Billy back toward the settlement. As they walked, he explained that a tree heavy with snow and ice had fallen across the main road during the night, completely blocking the only route that supply wagons could use to reach the settlement. When they arrived at the scene, Sarah saw the entire adult population of the settlement gathered around a massive oak tree that lay across the road like a fallen giant. The tree was far too large to move by hand, and its position made it impossible for wagons to find an alternate route through the surrounding terrain. We need every available man with an axe or saw, Elder Hartwell was saying as Sarah and Billy approached. This tree must be cleared before the next supply wagon arrives, or we'll all face serious hardship." Marcus Webb, who had been examining the fallen tree, looked up with concern. "This oak is over 3 feet thick at the trunk. Even with every man working, it could take days to cut through it, assuming our tools hold up to the task." Sarah listened to their discussion with growing understanding. The settlement depended entirely on supply wagons for items they could not produce themselves: medical supplies, certain foods, tools, and other necessities. If this tree remained in place much longer, everyone would suffer. "What about the sawmill in Riverside?" suggested David Morrison. "They have equipment that could cut through this tree in hours." "Riverside is 40 miles away," Artwell replied grimly. "By the time we send word and they organize a crew and then travel back here through this snow, we could be looking at 2 weeks or more. We can't wait that long." As the men continued discussing their limited options, Sarah found herself thinking about Running Bear and his companions. They had demonstrated impressive skill and knowledge about surviving in harsh winter conditions. Perhaps they would know of solutions that the settlement residents had not considered. The decision crystallized in her mind with sudden clarity. Sarah knew she faced exile from the settlement anyway. The council had given her until the end of the week to leave, and that deadline was only 4 days away. What did she have to lose by seeking help from people who had already shown her more kindness than her own neighbors? That evening, as the temperature dropped to dangerous levels, Sarah made a decision that would have shocked the settlement council if they had known about it. She bundled herself in every warm garment she owned, filled a small pack with supplies, and set out into the winter night to find Running Bear and his people. She had no clear idea where to look for them, but James had once mentioned seeing Native American camps along the river valley about 5 miles north of their homestead. The journey would be dangerous in daylight and potentially deadly at night, but Sarah felt she had no choice. The settlement had made clear they would not help her, but perhaps she could help them in return for a chance at a different kind of future. The snow had stopped falling, but the cold was intense enough to freeze exposed skin within minutes. Sarah wrapped a scarf around her face and focused on putting one foot in front of the other, following what she hoped was the correct direction toward the river valley. After walking for what seemed like hours, Sarah began to doubt her decision. The landscape looked identical in every direction, endless white plains broken only by occasional bare trees. She had no landmarks to guide her, and she began to fear she had become lost in a wilderness that would claim her life before dawn. Just when panic began to set in, she saw a faint orange glow in the distance. Someone had built a fire, and where there was fire there might be shelter and warmth. Sarah changed direction and stumbled through the snow toward the distant light, praying she would find help rather than new danger. As she drew closer, she could see the outline of several structures that appeared to be temporary shelters, and she could smell wood smoke carried on the wind. This was clearly a camp of some kind, though she could not yet tell who occupied it. When she was perhaps 100 yards away, 2 figures emerged from the darkness and blocked her path. In the firelight, she could see they were Native American men carrying weapons. One of them called out something in their language, and Sarah heard responses from the camp behind them. "Please," Sarah called out, her voice muffled by the scarf around her face. "I'm looking for Running Bear." "I'm Sarah McKinnon." The 2 men spoke rapidly to each other. Then one of them approached her more closely. He studied her face in the dim light, then said in heavily accented English, "McKinnon, woman? Why you come here in cold darkness?" "I need help," Sarah said simply, "and I think I can offer help in return." The man considered this for a moment, then gestured for her to follow him toward the camp. As they walked, Sarah realized she had just crossed a line that would change her life forever. Whatever happened next, she could never return to the simple role of grieving widow waiting for charity from her neighbors. The camp that gradually revealed itself in the firelight was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. Several dome-shaped structures made of bent poles and covered with animal hides provided shelter, while a large central fire pit served as both a source of warmth and a gathering place. The air smelled of smoke, cooking food, and the distinctive scent of cured leather. As they approached the fire, Sarah saw Running Bear sitting with several other men, apparently engaged in serious discussion. When he looked up and saw her approaching, his expression showed both surprise and concern. "McKinnon, woman," he said, rising to greet her, "why do you walk in darkness through snow that can kill?" Sarah pulled the scarf away from her face and tried to explain her desperate plan. "The settlement has a problem that threatens everyone. A large tree has fallen across the main road, blocking all supply wagons. They need help cutting it away, but they don't have the right tools or knowledge. Running Bear listened carefully, then asked, "And you think my people can solve this problem?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, "but you've shown wisdom about living in difficult conditions. Maybe you know methods they haven't considered. And what do you gain by helping white settlement that wants to cast you out?" Sarah had anticipated this question, and her answer came from deep conviction. "If I can help solve their crisis, maybe they will see me as valuable rather than as a burden. Maybe they will let me stay." Running Bear translated her words for the other men around the fire. Their discussion in the Lakota language continued for several minutes while Sarah stood shivering in the cold, uncertain whether she had made a terrible mistake. Finally, Running Bear turned back to her. "Sit by fire, warm yourself. We will talk of these things." As Sarah gratefully settled beside the warming flames, she realized she had committed herself to a path that would either save her future or destroy any chance she had of surviving the winter. But for the first time in months, she felt like she was taking action, rather than simply waiting for others to decide her fate. The conversation that followed would determine not just her own survival, but the future relationship between two very different communities struggling to coexist in an unforgiving wilderness. The warmth of the fire gradually brought feeling back to Sarah's frozen hands and feet, though the pain of thawing extremities made her wince. Around the fire sat 7 Lakota men of varying ages. From a teenager who might have been 16 to an elderly man whose weathered face spoke of many hard winters. They spoke in low voices, occasionally glancing at Sarah with expressions that ranged from curiosity to skepticism. Running Bear served as translator, explaining to his companions what Sarah had told him about the fallen tree and the settlement's desperate need for a solution. The discussion grew animated at times, with different voices offering what sounded like competing viewpoints. "Many of my people remember bad treatment from white settlers," Running Bear finally explained to Sarah. "They ask why we should help those who steal our land and call us savages." Sarah felt the weight of history and injustice in his words, but she also sensed that Running Bear himself was not entirely opposed to her proposal. "What do you think?" she asked him directly. "I think winter cares nothing for the color of a man's skin," he replied thoughtfully. "Cold will kill white children same as Indian children. Hunger makes all people suffer equally." The elderly man spoke at length in Lakota, gesturing towards Sarah several times. When he finished, Running Bear nodded respectfully before translating. "Grandfather Hawkfeather says your husband showed honor when he helped our sick people. He says debts of honor create bonds between peoples, not just individuals. If we help settlement, we honor your husband's memory, and perhaps create understanding where none existed before." The teenage boy who had been listening silently suddenly spoke with passionate intensity. Running Bear listened, then turned to Sarah with a slight smile. "My youngest nephew, Swift Arrow, says something very practical. He wants to know what tools the white men have tried to use on this tree, and what exactly makes it impossible for them to cut through it." Sarah realized she needed to provide much more specific information if these men were going to help. She described the size and position of the fallen oak, the limited number of axes and handsaws available in the settlement, and the difficult angle that made cutting extremely slow and dangerous. As she spoke, the men around the fire began asking detailed questions about the terrain, the exact location of the tree, and the timeline before the next supply wagon was expected. Their questions revealed sophisticated understanding of engineering and problem-solving that surprised Sarah. "White men think only of cutting through tree," Running Bear said after conferring with the others. "But there are other ways. Tree fell because roots could not hold in frozen ground. If roots are weak, maybe tree can be moved instead of cut." Swift Arrow jumped up excitedly and began sketching in the snow beside the fire, using a stick to illustrate some kind of mechanical principle. The other men gathered around his impromptu diagram, offering suggestions and modifications to whatever plan he was proposing. "Boy is very smart about moving heavy things," Running Bear explained. "Last summer he figured out way to move large stones for fish weir using leverage and rolling logs. Maybe same principles work for moving tree." Sarah watched in fascination as the group collaboratively developed what appeared to be an increasingly sophisticated plan. These men possessed practical knowledge and innovative thinking that could indeed solve the settlement's crisis, but she suddenly realized she had created a new problem for herself. "Even if you can help," she said slowly, How do I convince the settlement council to accept assistance from your people? Many of them fear Native Americans and would rather struggle alone than accept help from people they consider enemies. This question prompted another lengthy discussion in Lakota, with several voices speaking at once. Sarah could sense tension and disagreement, though she could not understand the specific nature of their debate. "This is true problem," Running Bear finally acknowledged. "Many of your people hate and fear us, same as many of my people hate and fear whites. Fear makes men stupid and cruel." Grandfather Hawkfeather spoke again, his ancient voice carrying obvious authority. The younger men listened respectfully, and when he finished, several of them nodded in agreement. "Grandfather says fear comes from not knowing," Running Bear translated. "When people work together to solve problem, they learn each other's true nature. Maybe this tree becomes chance to plant seeds of understanding instead of hatred. But how do we get them to agree to work together in the first place?" Sarah asked. Swift Arrow spoke up with obvious excitement, pointing to his snow diagram and speaking rapidly. Running Bear listened, then began to smile. "Boy has clever idea. He says you go back to settlement and tell them you found men who can solve tree problem. But you do not say we are Indian at first. When they are desperate enough, they will agree to accept help from strangers. Only then do they learn who we really are." Sarah considered the suggestion. It involved deception, which troubled her conscience, but it also represented perhaps the only realistic chance of bringing the two groups together peacefully. "There's still the problem of trust," she pointed out. "Even if they agree to work together on this project, what happens afterward? The settlement council has already decided to exile me, and they certainly won't welcome an ongoing relationship with your people." This comment sparked another intense discussion around the fire. Sarah could see that her words had touched on fundamental questions about the future of Native American and white settler relations in the territory. After several minutes, Running Bear turned to her with an expression of deep seriousness.
"We have decided to tell you something that could change everything, but you must promise to keep this knowledge secret until the right time comes to reveal it."
Sarah felt her heart racing. "What kind of secret?" "The territorial government in Pierre has been looking for ways to improve relations between white settlers and tribal peoples. They know that conflict serves no one's interests, and they want to establish trading partnerships and mutual cooperation." Running Bear paused to let his words sink in before continuing. 3 weeks ago, a government representative visited our main camp and asked our chief to consider participating in what he called a demonstration project. If we could show successful cooperation between Indians and whites on some practical problem, the territorial government would provide financial support and legal protection for future joint ventures. Sarah stared at him in amazement. "Are you saying this tree incident could become something much larger?" "Exactly. If we can solve this crisis together, and if your people can learn to see us as allies instead of threats, this could become the foundation for a new kind of relationship in this territory." The implications began to dawn on Sarah. Instead of simply trying to earn her way back into the settlement's good graces, she might be participating in something that could change the entire region's future. "But there are still enormous obstacles," she pointed out. "The settlement council includes men who have fought against Native Americans in the past. Some of them would rather die than accept help from people they consider enemies." Grandfather Hawkfeather had been listening carefully to their conversation, and now he spoke directly to Sarah in halting English. "White woman, you speak of fear and hatred like they are permanent things. But winter teaches different lesson. When snow threatens all life, wise people put aside old grudges and work together for survival. Those who cannot learn this lesson do not survive many winters." His words carried the weight of deep experience, and Sarah realized he was offering a perspective that could potentially overcome the prejudices and fears of both communities.
"What exactly would you need me to do?" she asked Running Bear.
"Return to settlement in morning. Tell council you have found men with tools and knowledge to move the tree. Say, these men require only food and warm shelter for their work, and ask nothing else in payment. When council agrees, send word to us and we will come." Sarah felt torn between hope and terror. This plan offered her a chance to transform her situation from helpless exile to vital bridge builder between communities. But it also carried enormous risks. If the plan failed, she would face consequences far worse than simple banishment. "What if the settlement people react violently when they discover who you really are?" she asked. "What if they think this is some kind of trap or attack?" Swift Arrow had been following the conversation with obvious interest, and now he spoke again with animated gestures. Running Bear translated with obvious amusement. Boy says white men are not stupid, even if they are sometimes ignorant. When they see Tree moved by skill and teamwork instead of fighting and destruction, they will understand we come as friends. Actions speak louder than fears. The confidence of these men began to influence Sarah's own thinking. They had clearly given serious thought to the challenges and risks involved, and their approach demonstrated both practical wisdom and genuine desire for peaceful cooperation. "There's one more thing you should know," Running Bear added quietly. "If this plan succeeds, and if territorial government supports ongoing cooperation between our peoples, there would be place for someone like you in this new arrangement." "What do you mean?" "Person who speaks both languages, understands both cultures, can help translate not just words but ideas and customs. Such person would be very valuable to territorial government and to both communities." Sarah felt a surge of possibility that she had not experienced since James's death. Instead of facing exile and destitution, she might find a new role as cultural mediator and bridge builder, contributing to something larger than her own survival. But first, she had to convince a group of prejudiced and frightened settlers to accept help from people they had been taught to fear and hate. As the fire began to burn lower, the men around it started to disperse to their sleeping places. Running Bear walked Sarah to the edge of the camp where one of the women had prepared a warm shelter for her to sleep in until morning. "Tomorrow begins test of courage for all of us," he said quietly. "Your people must find courage to trust their enemies. My people must find courage to help those who have shown them no kindness. And you must find courage to speak truth that could anger everyone." Sarah settled into the surprisingly comfortable shelter, wrapped in warm buffalo robes that smelled of wood smoke and prairie grass. For the first time in months, she felt warm and safe, but sleep came slowly as her mind raced through all the possible outcomes of tomorrow's crucial confrontation. Dawn came with crystal clear skies and temperatures so cold that the air itself seemed to glitter with ice crystals. Sarah was awakened by the smell of cooking food and the sound of quiet conversation outside her shelter. When she emerged, she found the entire camp busy with morning activities, but she noticed that several of the men were preparing equipment that looked like it was designed for heavy work: ropes, metal tools, and wooden implements she did not recognize. "They make ready for tree work," Running Bear explained as he handed her a bowl of warm stew. "When your people agree to our help, we will be prepared to move quickly." Sarah ate the hearty food gratefully, realizing it would give her strength for what promised to be the most challenging day of her life. As she prepared to leave the camp and return to the settlement, Running Bear gave her final instructions. "Remember," he said, "speak first of their need for help, not of who will provide it. When men are desperate, they become willing to consider solutions they would normally reject. Only after they agree to accept help should you reveal who we are." Sarah nodded, understanding the psychology behind his strategy. Fear and prejudice were powerful forces, but desperation could sometimes overcome both. "One more thing," Running Bear added. "If your people become angry or frightened when they learn the truth, do not try to defend us or argue with them. Instead, ask them to judge us by our actions, not by their fears. Actions are facts. Fears are only stories people tell themselves." With those words echoing in her mind, Sarah began the long walk back to the settlement, carrying with her the hopes of two communities and the weight of responsibility for bridging a gap that had divided peoples for generations. The sun was climbing toward noon when Sarah finally saw the familiar buildings of the settlement ahead. Smoke rose from chimneys, and she could see people moving about their daily activities, but the mood felt different from when she had left. There was a tension in the air that suggested the tree problem had grown more serious overnight. As she approached the main gathering area, Sarah saw that virtually the entire adult population had assembled around Elder Hartwell, who was speaking in urgent tones. When the people noticed Sarah approaching, conversation stopped and all eyes turned toward her. "Mrs. McKinnon," Hartwell called out, his voice sharp with stress. "Where have you been? We sent Billy Morrison to check on you this morning and your cabin was empty." Sarah realized she needed to explain her absence without revealing where she had actually spent the night. "I went looking for help with the tree problem," she said simply. Marcus Webb stepped forward, his expression skeptical. "Looking where?" "There's no one within 50 miles who could provide the kind of help we need." This was the moment Sarah had been preparing for during her long walk back to the settlement. The success or failure of everything that followed would depend on how she handled the next few minutes. "That's not true," she said, trying to project confidence she did not entirely feel. I know men who have tools and knowledge that could solve this problem. They can move the tree without cutting it. The crowd erupted in excited conversation. Moving the massive oak had not occurred to anyone in the settlement as a realistic possibility. What men? Hartwell demanded. Who are you talking about? Sarah took a deep breath and committed herself fully to Running Bear's plan. Men who understand leverage and mechanical principles. They've moved heavy obstacles before, and they believe they can move this tree off the road within a few days. Where are these men? Webb asked suspiciously. Why haven't we seen them before? They live in the area, but they keep to themselves, Sarah replied, which was technically true. They would require only food and shelter for their work, and they ask for no payment beyond that. David Morrison, who had been quiet until now, stepped forward with obvious interest. Sarah, if these men can really solve our problem, we need to contact them immediately. The supply wagon is due in 10 days, and if that road isn't clear, we're all going to face serious hardship. Hartwell looked torn between suspicion and desperate hope. I find it hard to believe that men with such capabilities have been living in this area without our knowledge. Sarah realized she needed to provide more convincing details without revealing the truth prematurely. They're travelers who have experience with engineering problems in difficult terrain. They happened to be camped nearby when I found them. This explanation seemed to satisfy most of the crowd, though Sarah could see that Hartwell remained skeptical. Assuming these men are real and can do what you claim, he said slowly, how quickly can you contact them? They're waiting for word from me, Sarah replied. If the settlement agrees to provide food and shelter in exchange for their help, they can begin work tomorrow morning. The crowd began talking excitedly among themselves. The prospect of a real solution to their crisis was so appealing that most people seemed willing to overlook any irregularities in Sarah's story. What do we have to lose? Morrison asked the crowd. If these men can solve our problem, we should at least give them the chance to try. And if they can't, Webb demanded, then we've wasted time and resources we can't afford to spare. Hartwell raised his hand for silence. The council will need to discuss this proposal. Mrs. McKinnon will give you our answer by evening. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah felt both relief and anxiety. The first phase of the plan had succeeded, but the real test would come when Running Bear and his companions arrived at the settlement. Everything would depend on whether the practical need for help could overcome generations of prejudice and fear. That evening, as Sarah waited in her cabin for the council's decision, she realized that she had already crossed a point of no return. Regardless of what happened with the tree, she had demonstrated value to the settlement and had given herself a chance to remain in the only home she had known as a married woman. But more importantly, she had set in motion events that could transform the relationship between two peoples who had been taught to see each other as enemies. Tomorrow would reveal whether fear or hope would prove stronger in the hearts of ordinary people facing an extraordinary challenge. The knock on Sarah's door came just as darkness fell completely across the prairie. She opened it to find Billy Morrison standing on her porch, his young face serious in the lamplight. Mrs. McKinnon, he said formally, the council has reached a decision. They want to see you right away. Sarah wrapped her heavy coat around herself and followed Billy through the snow to the community meeting house, a simple wooden building that served as the settlement's center for important gatherings. Inside, she found the 3 council members seated at a rough wooden table, with several other prominent settlement members standing behind them. Elder Hartwell wasted no time with pleasantries. Mrs. McKinnon, we've decided to accept your proposal. The situation with the blocked road has become critical, and we're willing to try any reasonable solution. Sarah felt a surge of relief mixed with terror. The easy part was over. Now came the real challenge. However, Hartwell continued, we have conditions. These men must agree to work under the supervision of our people. They must remain in the designated work area during their stay, and they must leave immediately once the job is completed. The suspicion in his voice made it clear that he still harbored serious doubts about Sarah's mysterious helpers, but desperation had overcome his caution. I'll convey your terms to them. Sarah replied, they should be here by tomorrow morning if they agree to proceed. Marcus Webb stepped forward with obvious skepticism still written on his face. McKinnon, I hope you understand the seriousness of this situation. If these men fail to deliver what you've promised, or if they prove to be anything other than legitimate workers, the consequences will be severe. The implied threat was unmistakable. Sarah realized that her own fate was now tied directly to the success or failure of Running Bear's plan. "I understand," she said quietly. As Sarah walked back to her cabin through the bitter cold, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. In a few hours, she would either help create a breakthrough in relations between two hostile communities, or she would precipitate a crisis that could result in violence and tragedy. That night, Sarah barely slept. She lay in her bed, listening to the wind howling across the prairie, and trying to imagine every possible scenario for the next day's events. Would the settlement people react with fear and anger when they learned the truth? Would Running Bear and his companions be able to demonstrate their good intentions before prejudice and panic took control? Just before dawn, Sarah dressed warmly and set out to meet Running Bear at the prearranged location, a grove of cottonwood trees about halfway between the settlement and the Lakota camp. The early morning air was so cold that her breath created white clouds, and the snow crunched loudly under her feet as she walked through the grey pre-dawn light. She found Running Bear and 5 other men waiting in the shelter of the trees, along with several horses carrying what appeared to be specialized equipment. In the growing daylight, Sarah could see that they had brought ropes, metal tools, wooden levers, and other implements that looked designed for moving heavy objects. "Your people agreed?" Running Bear asked without preamble. "Yes, but they have conditions. You must work under supervision, stay in the work area, and leave immediately when finished." Running Bear translated this information for his companions, who received it with expressions that suggested they had expected such restrictions. "We understand," Running Bear replied. "Fear makes people want to control what they do not understand. We will accept their conditions and prove our intentions through our actions." Swift Arrow said something in Lakota that made the other men chuckle, and Running Bear smiled as he translated. "Boy says white men always want to supervise Indian work, but they usually learn more than they teach." As they began walking toward the settlement, Sarah realized that this short journey represented a historic moment. For the first time in the region's history, Native Americans and white settlers were approaching each other as potential partners rather than enemies. When the settlement buildings came into view, Sarah could see that a large crowd had already gathered near the fallen tree. Word of the day's events had clearly spread throughout the community, and everyone wanted to witness either a remarkable success or a spectacular failure. As they drew closer, Sarah noticed the exact moment when the settlement people realized the nature of their would-be helpers. Conversation stopped abruptly, and several people stepped backward instinctively. The tension in the air became palpable, and Sarah feared that fear and prejudice would immediately overwhelm any practical considerations. Elder Hartwell stepped forward from the crowd, his face pale but his voice steady. "Mrs. McKinnon, what is the meaning of this?" Before Sarah could respond, Running Bear spoke directly to the crowd in clear English. "I am Running Bear of the Lakota people. We come to help with tree that blocks your road." The silence that followed felt dangerous. Sarah could see hands moving toward weapons, and she realized that the situation was balanced on a knife's edge between cooperation and conflict. "You brought Indians here?" Marcus Webb demanded, his voice rising with anger and fear. "Have you lost your mind?" Sarah took a deep breath and committed herself fully to the path she had chosen. "I brought men who can solve our problem when we could not solve it ourselves." "We don't need help from savages," someone shouted from the back of the crowd. Running Bear remained perfectly calm despite the hostility. "You call us savages, but we come with tools and knowledge to help, not weapons to fight. Judge us by our actions today, not by your fears." David Morrison, who had been studying the equipment the Lakota men had brought, stepped forward with obvious interest. "What exactly do you propose to do?" Swift Arrow began unpacking some of his equipment and gestured toward the massive fallen tree. Speaking in a mixture of English and Lakota, with Running Bear translating, he began explaining his plan for using leverage and rolling logs to move the oak off the road. Several of the settlement men listened with growing fascination as the engineering principles were explained. Despite their prejudices, they could recognize sophisticated thinking and practical knowledge when they saw it. "This could actually work," Morrison said slowly. "The principles are sound." But Hartwell remained unconvinced. "Even if their plan is feasible, how do we know this isn't some kind of trick? How do we know they won't attack us once we're working alongside them?" Grandfather Hawk Feather, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward and spoke directly to Hartwell in heavily accented but clear English. "Old man, I have lived through many winters and many battles. If we wanted to attack you, We would not come with tools for moving trees. We would come with weapons in darkness. His words carried such obvious wisdom and sincerity that even some of the most suspicious settlement members seemed to reconsider their assumptions. Furthermore, Grandfather Hawkfeather continued, "Winter does not care about skin color or language. Cold will kill all our children equally if supplies cannot reach this place. Wise people work together when death threatens all." A murmur of agreement arose from parts of the crowd. The practical reality of their desperate situation was beginning to overcome abstract fears and prejudices. Sarah realized this was the crucial moment. "Look at what they've brought," she said, gesturing to the specialized equipment. "Look at the thought and planning that went into this solution. These men came prepared to work, not to fight." Elder Hartwell studied the faces of the Lakota men for a long moment, then looked at the massive tree that had defied all their efforts to remove it. Finally, he spoke with obvious reluctance. "If you can truly move this tree, we'll allow you to try, but you'll work under constant supervision, and any suspicious behavior will be met with immediate response." Running Bear nodded acceptance of these terms. "We understand your caution. Let our work speak for our intentions." What followed over the next 3 days would be remembered in the settlement for generations to come. Working under the careful supervision of several armed settlement men, the Lakota team demonstrated engineering skills and innovative thinking that amazed even the most skeptical observers. Using a complex system of levers, pulleys, and rolling logs, they gradually shifted the massive oak tree inch by inch until it no longer blocked the road. The work required not only technical knowledge, but also precise coordination and tremendous physical effort. As the hours passed, several settlement men began volunteering to help with the more labor-intensive aspects of the project. By the second day, the initial suspicion and hostility had given way to grudging respect and even friendly collaboration. Settlement men found themselves working side by side with Lakota men, sharing tools and techniques, and discovering that their supposed enemies were simply people trying to solve a difficult problem. Swift Arrow proved particularly popular with the younger settlement men, who were fascinated by his innovative approach to mechanical problems. His enthusiasm and obvious intelligence broke down barriers faster than any formal diplomacy could have achieved. "That boy has a natural gift for engineering," David Morrison told Sarah, as they watched Swift Arrow explaining some complex pulley arrangement to a group of attentive listeners. "He sees solutions where the rest of us see only obstacles." On the third day, as the massive oak finally rolled completely clear of the road, a cheer went up from the combined crowd of settlement residents and Lakota workers. The celebration was spontaneous and genuine, born from the shared satisfaction of solving a problem that had seemed impossible. But the real breakthrough came that evening, when Elder Hartwell approached Running Bear with an unexpected proposition. "Your people have honored their commitment," Hartwell said formally. "The road is clear, and you've asked for nothing beyond the food and shelter we agreed to provide. But before you leave, I'd like to discuss something more." Running Bear waited patiently for Hartwell to continue. "Winter isn't over, and there will be other problems, other emergencies that require more knowledge and skills than our small community possesses. Would your people be willing to consider some kind of ongoing arrangement for mutual assistance?" Sarah felt her heart racing as she realized the implications of Hartwell's words. This was exactly the kind of breakthrough that Running Bear had hoped for, but which had seemed almost impossible just 3 days earlier. "What kind of arrangement do you have in mind?" Running Bear asked carefully. "Trade partnerships, shared resources during emergencies, perhaps even joint projects that could benefit both our communities," Hartwell replied. "I'll be honest, 3 days ago I would never have considered such a proposal. But watching your people work alongside ours has changed my perspective." The conversation that followed established the foundation for what would become a model relationship between Native American and white settler communities in the Dakota Territory. Over the subsequent months, the two groups collaborated on numerous projects, sharing knowledge and resources in ways that benefited everyone involved. Sarah found herself playing an increasingly important role as interpreter and mediator between the communities. Her ability to understand both cultures and translate not just languages but customs and expectations made her invaluable to both groups. 6 months later, a representative from the territorial government in Pierre arrived to investigate reports of successful cooperation between Indians and whites in the region. What he found exceeded the most optimistic expectations of the demonstration project he had discussed with the Lakota leadership months earlier. This could serve as a model for the entire territory, the government official told Sarah during one of their meetings. What you've helped create here demonstrates that cooperation benefits everyone more than conflict. As part of the territorial government's support for the ongoing partnership, Sarah was offered a formal position as cultural liaison and interpreter, with a salary that provided her with financial independence and security she had never known. A year after James's death had left her facing exile and destitution, Sarah found herself at the center of a transformed community where former enemies had become partners and collaborators. The bitter winter that had seemed like it would destroy her had instead created opportunities she could never have imagined. But perhaps the most significant change was in Sarah herself. The frightened widow who had once waited passively for others to decide her fate had become a confident bridge builder who actively shaped the future of her community. Standing in her new home, a larger cabin built with assistance from both settlement residents and Lakota craftsmen, Sarah often reflected on the series of choices that had led her to this unexpected life. Each decision to trust rather than fear, to seek help rather than accept defeat, had opened new possibilities she could not have foreseen. The fallen tree that had threatened to isolate and destroy the settlement had instead become the foundation for a new kind of community, one built on cooperation rather than conflict, mutual respect rather than suspicion. That moment of courage, born from complete desperation, had changed not just her own life but the entire character of the region. 2 years after the tree incident, Sarah married Running Bear in a ceremony that combined elements of both Lakota and Christian traditions. Their wedding was attended by members of both communities and became a symbol of the transformation that had begun with one widow's desperate search for help in the coldest winter anyone could remember. The settlement that had once prepared to exile her now celebrated her as the person who had brought them solutions they could never have found alone. The Lakota people who had welcomed her in her darkest hour now honored her as a bridge between worlds that had once seemed permanently divided by fear and misunderstanding. Years later, when government officials and newspaper writers came to study the remarkable cooperation between Indians and whites in their region, they always wanted to hear the story of how it all began. Sarah would tell them about the terrible winter, the fallen tree, and the desperate choices that had led her to seek help from supposed enemies. But she would always emphasize that the real story was not about her individual courage or wisdom. The real story was about what became possible when people chose to trust each other despite their fears, when they judged others by their actions rather than their prejudices, and when they recognized that cooperation served everyone's interests better than conflict. Winter taught us that we all face the same fundamental challenges, Sarah would tell her visitors. Cold, hunger, and isolation threaten all people equally. When we learned to see each other as potential allies rather than inevitable enemies, we discovered strengths we never knew we possessed. The tree that had fallen across their road had blocked their path for only a few days, but the bridge they had built between their communities would last for generations, creating a legacy of cooperation that spread far beyond the boundaries of their small corner of the Dakota Territory. In the end, the widow who had been left in the ice had not only survived but had helped create warmth that melted the barriers between peoples who had been taught to hate each other. Her story became a testament to the transformative power of choosing hope over fear, collaboration over conflict, and trust over suspicion, even in the most desperate of circumstances.